What inspired you to attempt an Ironman Triathlon in the Antarctica?
I think initially the idea was like the battle between being the best in the world at something or do something as the first person ever. And, at this point in time, I was in the triathlon world and I thought, instead of spending many years on trying to become the best, what could I do that hadn't been done before within the sport? And for some reason, the first idea I had was whether an Ironman distance triathlon had been completed on all continents, because then I could be the first person to do it on a new continent. And I was late to the trend in 2017, so there were already established races on all the regular continents that we think of. Antarctica was the only one remaining. And then I did what you're supposed to do with crazy ideas. I started telling people about this idea of doing the first long distance triathlon in Antarctica. And then, as you can probably imagine, people told me that was impossible, that it was impossible for me to swim 4 kilometers in ice water, nearly 4 kilometers in ice water. I would die of hypothermia, that you couldn't bike in Antarctica, there are no roads there, that I was just an amateur. I'd only done one regular Ironman before that. But it was all valid points, but it also made me reflect on the fact that the people telling me this were people who hadn't done triathlons themselves. They had zero cold water exposure. So how would they actually know whether this was possible or not? And I think what it really triggered further on for me was looking back on the previous crazy ideas I've had in my life. When I was a teenager, it was to become a professional soccer player, but I wasn't the most talented kid. So nobody believed that was possible. And in my early 20s, it was to start my own business. But I was told that was too risky, that you needed an education, a plan B before doing something as risky as that. All this from people who not necessarily had any background or experience within either football or making businesses themselves. So for me, it really became like the realization that limitations are our own, other people's perception of what is possible. And for me, that became the purpose of doing the Iceman in the end, to show especially the younger generations that in the end it's all down to what we believe that we're capable of, and daring to pursue our craziest, most ambitious dreams or ideas, whatever other people may think we're capable of or not.
What were some of the biggest challenges you faced during the Ironman, and how did you manage to overcome them?
There were a lot of challenges. First of all, just to make the whole expedition happen, it was a 40-day expedition, 10 people going, so a lot of logistical challenges, financial challenges of making it happen. But then when it all came down to the Iceman itself, for me, the biggest challenge was whether it was possible to swim that long in ice water. And I had done a lot of tests and progressively challenged myself, because I had no cold water experience before starting the project. But then in the end, doing a lot of extreme cold water tests, where I went to some of the most extreme places on Earth, Svalbard, Greenland, Iceland. And then in the end, coming down to that 3.8 kilometer swim in Antarctica that I managed to finish in 1 hour and 10 minutes, which is probably the coldest 1 hour and 10 minutes of my life. But I managed to pull off the swim. So that for me was the most physically uncomfortable challenge of them all. And for me, the biggest barrier of whether this was actually possible. From then on, I faced probably the most physically straining and challenging part in the end, which was the bike leg. Because of the conditions, I was already biking on a fat bike, which is tough in itself because the tires are very wide, so I have better grip. But because it ironically was very warm the day I did it, the surface sort of melted, then it came into this slush ice. So it was nearly impossible for me to bike the 180 kilometers, and it took me 33 and a half hours to finish that leg, which was what nearly broke me, both physically and mentally for sure. But I managed to break through that. And then it wasn't over. We faced a blizzard in the end during the run, which kept us isolated in our tents. When I had 20 kilometers left on the run, we were isolated for 27 hours. But then after that, I think I had faced all challenges that Antarctica had to offer. And I managed to finish the Iceman in just around 73 hours.
How did you manage to stay motivated and focused during such a mentally and physically very grueling event?
I think, I had made the decision that I was going to do this. And in my mind, that was what I was going to do. So I was not thinking about that wouldn't be the case at all. It was just facing one challenge at the time. And then when you're doing something, not only for you the first time, but, a first time ever, there's a lot of learnings along the way that you can use for anything. You just have to go with it. But I think when I was almost breaking down, especially on the bike after 24 hours, I still had more than 80 kilometers to go on the bike and a marathon to run, and I hadn't slept at the time. I was so physically exhausted. Then you go into a very dark space in your mind, and I think what kept me going through then was realizing why I was there. I knew the purpose was to show that limitations are perceptions. I just don't think I had realized I had to break my own perception of where my limit was, probably in the end. But knowing that was actually why I came there, to break through that low point. And once I'd done that, it was just a question of when I was going to finish it. It was challenging, very challenging, especially when you're going for that long and knowing how much you still have ahead. It is a big challenge, but for me it's always breaking it down into smaller steps and then just trying to focus on the positives. And I knew I was never going to swim those 3.8 kilometers in ice water again, so I had to. This was now or never, basically.
How do you think do our perceptions of limitations impact our ability to achieve our goals?
I think it impacts our life and our ability to achieve our goals in a massive way. Often also some things that we're not conscious of. What I usually say when I'm doing keynote speaks is that the most common limit we place upon ourselves without thinking about it is something that we all do, which is setting goals. Because a goal can be a limit in itself if it's what I would call a realistic goal, because a realistic goal doesn't force you to challenge yourself or think differently. In the end, that can become a limiter of yourself and your own sort of barriers that you operate within. But daring to push yourself and really break your own perceptions of where limits are, and also when it comes to goals, what excites me at least, because oftentimes when you set these, what people say unrealistic goal, we don't know how we're going to achieve them, but we just know that we want to get there. And then when we know this, then we just look at the next realistic step and figure out, okay, how do we break that down? That was the same for me in the impossible ice swim. I broke it down to the first ice water test. And then eventually, when we do these tests over and over, we will eventually get to where we didn't, we perhaps couldn't see how we would get there in the end. So being aware of how you perceive yourself and what you're capable of is a big step towards achieving your, whatever crazy goal that you may have. And also being aware of the classic thing, again, coming back to ice swim, is that when I'm challenging people to do cold plunging, people say, oh, I can't be in for 30 seconds. I can't do 1 minute, I can't do it at all. And then it's just funny to see how when you guide people and help them get over the initial shock and, get into the breathing rhythm and try to stay calm in a stressful situation, they can go way longer than they thought they could. So being aware of oftentimes what your mind is telling you is not actually the truth. It's just from your sort of comfort zone that you're placed within, and your mind is doing whatever it can to let you to keep you within that. But knowing that you can do way more than oftentimes your own mind tells you.